في محاضرتنا الليلة الدكتورة سنام فكيل، هي نائبة المدير وباحث أول في برنامج دراسات الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا في شاتام هاوس بريطانيا. درست الماجستير والدكتوراه في جامعة جون هوبكنز علاقات دولية، وهي أيضا تدرس في مدرسة الدراسات المتقدمة، هي basically Middle Eastern Advanced Studies of International Relations International Studies في جون هوبكنز، ولكن في بولونيا في إيطاليا. وأيضا لها كتاب اسمه Women and Politics in Iran Action and Reaction، المرأة والسياسة في إيران، فعل ورد فعل. ولديها أيضا كتابات عديدة في منصات أكاديمية وبحثية والإعلامية. قبل البدء اسمحوا لي بس أن أعطيكم نبذة عن سلسلة المحاضرات التي تقدمها أو يقدمها مركز الملك فيصل. مركز الملك فيصل منذ نشأته في 1983 وهو معني ويجتهد في إكمال رسالة الملك فيصل رحمه الله بإنتاج المعرفة وأيضا تحقيق التبادل المعرفي بين المملكة والعالم. والمركز لا ينتج الأبحاث فقط، وإنما يوفر منصة تجمع بين الباحثين في مختلف التخصصات والمجالات من المملكة والعالم. وهذه سلسلة المحاضرات هذه تأتي في هذا السياق، في سياق الجمع بين الباحثين المتخصصين وبيننا وبينكم جميعا. خلفية عن محاضرة اليوم، المحاضرة هي كما ترون العنوان إعادة النظر في الأمن الإقليمي. فلماذا محاضرة اليوم؟ مسألة الأمن الإقليمي مسألة ملحة بالنسبة للمنطقة، من عدة عقود ونحن نعاني في هذه المنطقة من صراعات ونزاعات متواصلة. التوتر مرتفع على مستوى العالم العربي ومحيطه، وفي السنوات الأخيرة بدأت تظهر نوع من الاهتمام الأكثر إلحاحا بمسألة ضرورة تخفيف التوتر أو حل النزاع في أحسن الأحوال، ولكن تخفيف التوتر وإدارة النزاع في أقلها. وتأتي هذه المحاضرة في هذا السياق. الدكتورة سنام فكيل بالاشتراك مع الدكتور نيل كوليام وهو جالس بيننا أعدوا دراسة قبل تقريبا 6 أشهر شملت أو سندت على أكثر من 200 مقابلة لشخصيات من صناع السياسات في 15 دولة. ال15 دولة هذه هي الدول المعنية والمرتبطة أو التي يتعلق بها النزاع في المنطقة، أو الدول الأجنبية مثل الولايات المتحدة، أوروبا، دول أوروبية التي تشارك أو تساهم في تخفيف النزاع أو ربما حتى في إثارة النزاع في بعض الحالات. فهذه المحاضرة تأتي في هذا السياق. نتائج هذه الدراسة كانت مجموعة من الرؤى حول سبل، وسائل، استراتيجيات، رؤى لتخفيف النزاع في المنطقة. الورقة ليست طويلة جدا ويمكن أن تجدونها في موقع شاتام هاوس، وأنصح بشدة بالاطلاع عليها. ستجد ستكون مثرية جدا وأيضا مثيرة للتفكير في هذا الموضوع الحيوي. الدكتورة سنام فكيل ستتحدث لمدة 30 دقيقة وبعدها سنبدأ النقاش، فضلا التأكد من أن الجوالات صامتة. والمحاضرة وإدارتها ستقدم باللغة الإنجليزية وهنالك ترجمة فورية ويمكنكم السؤال بالعربي أو بالإنجليزي. ختاما الشكر للزملاء المنظمين في إدارة العلاقات العامة، في إدارة التقنية وغيرها من الزملاء، وشكرا لكم لحضوركم ولوقتكم. ودكتورة سنام تفضلي. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the King Faisal Center. Such a pleasure to be here today, and it's my honor to be here to discuss a paper that I co-wrote and published with my colleague, Dr. Neil Quilliam. I was joking before that he should be up on the stage with me so he can share in the discussion. I think that I'm only partially to blame and partially to benefit from this opportunity. So I would like to acknowledge that we worked very hard together in this project. And before we get started, I wanted to give you a bit of background as to how we approach this topic. that we published in a paper at Chatham House just earlier this year. I have lost a bit of my time and perspective, but this is a follow-on paper that we published in 2019. And our paper in 2019 looked to examine specifically the Trump administration's approach to Iran and its 12 demands towards Iran, which led to the Trump administration withdrawing from the Iran nuclear program. And in the 12 demands, in addition to seeking to revise the Iran nuclear agreement or the JCPOA, they specifically prioritized trying to address regional issues. And one of the principal findings of that paper that was based on a similar methodology of interviews, which I will discuss in a minute, was that regional issues in the Middle East remain a primary challenge, not unique to only Iran, but really impacting all countries of the Middle East and North Africa. And so, as a follow-on to that paper, we sought to take on this issue of regional security and broader regional challenges. As we all know, the Middle East has long been beset by multiple interlocked regional conflicts, but in particular over the last decade, these conflicts from our perspective, and as was defined and revealed by our research, they have become more entrenched. We have perhaps seen the high point of those tensions, but our research really sought to unpack the drivers of those conflicts and how best to try and address regional security challenges. So in my discussion here today, I would like to present really the findings of our paper, which is a data-based driven findings. These are not my personal opinion, which oftentimes people assume I'm presenting my own views. For that, we would have to talk and have tea afterwards to really reveal what I'm thinking. This paper really seeks to examine or reconsider the issue of security in the region. And I think there have been two principal concepts underpinning security in the Middle East or globally. And there have been a dynamic of collective security, which has long driven regional security, and collective security approaches have been used for states to unite against external threats, balancing against aggression. And I will show you some examples of those models, but this collective security approach is not inclusive, but rather brings together like-minded states to manage external threats. One of the outcomes or conclusions of our paper is that the issue of collective security, or the concept of collective security, has not succeeded in helping Middle Eastern states manage regional security challenges. And one of the conclusions we put forward, again drawing from our data, is perhaps it's time for the region to consider a cooperative security framework. And that cooperative security model brings together states that don't necessarily share the same security threats, but because of their geographic proximity to each other, they work together to try and address and solve common problems. And you do that, or you see that approach, particularly in the European Union model that came together in the aftermath of World War II, known as the OSCE process. And that process tried to build common principles of cooperation and common views on how states should cooperate, and to manage differences and manage disagreements in a communal setting. So I thought it would be useful to just lay out the differences in these approaches as we look at the findings of our paper and the outcome of our work. Oh, sorry. A little bit further, digging into regional security in the Middle East, I think it's important to sort of lay out a few foundational issues that emerged as part of our research. One of the principal challenges in the region is that obviously many different countries in the Middle East have divergent security threats. We don't all share the same threat of each other. And I'm just using the collective we. I am not associating with any country, but obviously Saudi Arabia has a certain threat perception that might be very different from the threat perception of Iraq versus the threat perception of Egypt. And these threat perceptions don't remain stagnant. They evolve based on the emergence of new threats. So this is an evolving issue. So having dialogue and discussion on the evolving nature of threat perceptions is hugely important. But in order to sort of break down regional challenges, it's important to understand the different perspectives of each state and how they see their threat perceptions. Without that sort of understanding, obviously, you cannot arrive at a collective framework because there will always be somebody who remains misunderstood. And I think that in the region, there are many cases like this that we can draw upon. Security and threat perceptions have clearly changed over time in the Middle East and North Africa. We have always taken a state-centric approach to understanding threat perceptions, and my education has drawn on international relations theory, which is very state-centric, and you know, the view of and the ideologies coming from different states have also evolved, leading to new threats or new regional challenges over the past century in the Middle East. But I think also what's important to note is that threat perceptions are also emerging from non-state actors, not just from states. And obviously, non-state actors can be sponsored by states, but they can also be sponsored by individuals or extraterritorial state actors. So the emergence of non-state actors is important in understanding threat perceptions as well. And thirdly, issue-based threats are also emerging and understanding the nature of issue-based threats in our perception of threat perceptions is equally important. Climate change, you know, we're on the eve of COP26 in the UK, in Glasgow, and climate change, of course, is emerging as a global challenge, you know, a huge threat globally, but of course in the Middle East and North Africa, this is a particular challenge that all states face, I think, in a quite urgent way. And so issue-based threats are perhaps seen and externalized between states, but they can also be used to bring states together and to build more cooperative discussions as well. And I've listed some other issues like a global pandemic as an opportunity of an issue-based threat that can create more occasion for collaboration and a sense of communal threat perceptions in a region. Historically, in the Middle East and North Africa, we have relied on a collective security model, and I will look at a number of them just to give you a sense of perspective. But also, the region has primarily looked to external actors as a guarantor of their security as well. And it's important to consider the geopolitical climate of today and how geopolitics and the increasing competitive dynamics between the United States and China might be leading to reprioritization of the United States as the principal guarantor of regional security for most Middle Eastern countries, and how that impacts and how that can affect regional security going forward. Sorry. In our paper, we identify a variety of different approaches that have been pursued by states primarily in addressing threats in the region. There have been a variety of different organizations that have been developed, many of which are still functional and still convene, but have not been successful at managing regional conflict and have not been successful at stemming wars in the region. We presented the regional organizations or regional efforts in 3 different dimensions. The first was a focus to create Arab unity, and of course the Arab League, which came together in 1945, and continues to meet today, of course, has played a very important role as an organization, and most recently, and it's not quite so recently, but even in 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative proposed by the kingdom here was put forward offering normalization with Israel in exchange for withdrawal from the occupied territories in Palestine. But the Arab League has not yet succeeded in addressing huge regional challenges, particularly in the case of Israel and Palestine. We've had other examples like the Organization of Islamic Countries, but that's not particularly regional focused. There have been other efforts related to regional security and regional conflict management that I have listed here, beginning with the Madrid peace talks in the 1990s that led to the Oslo peace process, Camp David Accords, all in an effort to try and address Israeli-Palestinian tensions and the conflict. There have been also a relatively successful effort, the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group, that brought together a number of regional states over a longer period of time to discuss security issues, defense and cooperation agreements, and that was perhaps the effort that was most closest to achieving a more cooperative security framework, but that effort also didn't succeed. One might include the Abraham Accords as another such focus that has recently emerged as a regional security model. And there is a third and sort of final basket of approaches that exist in managing regional tensions with Iran. There was the UN Security Council Resolution 598 that was declared in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war that did call for a regional security framework to be developed, but that has not yet come to fruition. But you oftentimes hear analysts and policymakers referring to this resolution as providing justification for the creation of a regional security framework, and others have looked at the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, as a foundational first step, perhaps, in addressing regional security challenges. But of course, that agreement is only relegated to Iran's nuclear program and didn't go far enough to address Iran's role in regional countries beyond its borders and its proliferation of lethal aid to proxy groups outside its borders as well. So this is a bit of background on regional security, which will sort of take us to what I really want to spend the rest of my time today briefly discussing. Neil and I, over a long period of time, applied an interview-based methodology to test out our questions and assumptions about regional security and their challenges in the Middle East and North Africa. Along with a team of researchers, we interviewed 210 policymakers and analysts in 15 countries, not all of them in the Middle East, and I will just go through the countries very briefly. We did interview the US analysts and policymakers, Russians, Chinese, Germans, French, and British. So, and then within the region, we spoke to experts and analysts in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. I think that's it. All with an effort to try and align views, and I'm sure you're going to ask me why I picked those countries or why we came up with those countries, and some of it has to do with the previous methodology and the previous countries that we focused on, and because we wanted to take a regional approach, we prioritized interviews in countries where we identified as regional conflict areas. Libya remained outside the purview of our work. We thought that was a bit, it would broaden the scope of our project a little further than we had ambition for. So we did remain focused on Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Not to say that we can't broaden our scope going forward. These interviews were all conducted under the Chatham House rule, or were confidential. We would not reveal the identity of our interviewees, but through the confidentiality, we had very candid conversations and asked our interviewees to share their views on how they saw conflict best being managed in the broader Middle East, what were the best pathways to arriving at regional security, what were the challenges or the obstructions blocking progress towards regional security, how they defined and saw geopolitical tensions impacting regional security dynamics, what were the drivers of regional tensions between states as well as between Middle Eastern states, and then, of course, we sought their views on how best to address regional security challenges. Our data, which I will get to, but here are some sort of top lines. There was a very widespread consensus that a regional security process was urgently needed for the Middle East region. And we did ask, as I'll show you here in this slide, would we benefit? And of course, almost everyone said yes. But that question was followed by a very lengthy answer, which generally went but. And then the but went on for about 40 minutes as to why the Middle East was not ready for a regional security framework. And the why generally went on and on about the prevalence of a number of wars and the multi-polarity that has begun to define conflicts in the Middle East. We are no longer in a unipolar Middle East where the US is the predominant external power, but we have a broader engagement of China and Russia, but also of multiple state actors in all of the conflicts around the region. And so that makes resolving each of these conflicts much more difficult. So if you just look at the case of Syria, for example, a war that the United States has been involved in. You also have Russia as an external player, along with Turkey, Iran. You also have China potentially involved in reconstruction over a longer period of time. And then a plethora of Arab states that have supported different sides in that decade-long conflict. So you see that you have multiple stakeholders. Forget about the indigenous Syrian population in the equation. You have multiple external stakeholders that seek to be involved in conflict resolution and management. So identifying multipolarity was huge. It was part of the very long but that came out in a majority of our interviewees. So while the time is, or while a security process is needed, our report concluded that this couldn't come through a top-down policymaker-led, state-led process, but rather should come over time through the creation of tracks or processes that would isolate conflicts and build confidence over time. And that should be arrived at and should be created through discussion, through de-escalation and conflict resolution. And those processes, above all, should not be led or pushed by external actors, but should be particularly driven by regional actors themselves. And this was another huge finding that I will point to towards the end of my slides as well. Finally, another part of the big but is the issue of external actors that did feature prominently in a number of our findings. A majority of interviewees saw that the time of the election of the Biden administration presented a unique opportunity for the United States, for external actors, but also for regional actors themselves to recalibrate, to take pause, and perhaps to invest in de-escalation and conflict management. And we, in fact, are seeing this underway today. We haven't seen, let's say, de-escalation agreements emerge, but we are seeing multiple actors around the Middle East, multiple states investing in dialogue, bilateral dialogue and multilateral dialogue. And I think this is driven by this perhaps unique moment, and also driven by what is very clearly evidenced through multiple American administrations of the reprioritization of US interests towards geopolitical challenges and tensions with China, as well as to domestic priorities. And we've seen this as a consistent theme emerge under the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, and again echoed very clearly by the Biden administration. And I think that this realization and this awakening perhaps could be driving regional states to prioritize de-escalation going forward. Our findings, interestingly, I'll get to that in a second, we did not, in our interviews, try to provide our interviewees with specific frameworks to pick from. But we did ask them, what security model do you think would work most effectively in the Middle East? And quite independently, you will see from the data here, our interviewees saw that the JCPOA was an important step, not necessarily to provide a holistic regional security framework for the region, but was repeatedly identified as an important first step in addressing a very hot conflict that also contributed to regional instability. This, of course, was made more acute during the Trump administration, the imposition of maximum pressure sanctions on Iran, and the period of 2019 when Iran also implemented its own maximum resistance strategy and began to export instability into the region. So interestingly, 45% of respondents saw the JCPOA as an important model that wouldn't be holistic to the region, but could be a first step at tempering regional conflicts. And beyond that, of course, you have 24% of respondents looking at the OSCE model as being useful. And interestingly, this OSCE model, which remains the basis for conflict management and de-escalation in Europe and with the Soviet Union, was important in creating common understandings of each other in a cooperative security model, as I introduced at the beginning. Going further, and sort of, we did ask our interviewees, and we conducted our interviews through the US elections. So we did prepare, we had a plan to also provide answers should President Trump be reelected, but in the context of a Biden election, a majority of interviewees, and there were multiple responses to this question, but a majority of interviewees thought that the Biden administration should prioritize a return to the JCPOA as a first step to addressing regional security challenges. But you'll also see that 20% saw it important that the Biden administration invest in a regional security process. And there are other, of course, responses here, which include that they saw that the Biden administration would do nothing, that they would balance ties among the GCC states, and of course, our report, our interviewees also took place before the Al-Ula agreement was concluded this January, but nevertheless, this was addressed and was identified by interviewees as an important regional challenge and a critical challenge for the GCC. So you will see a variety of issues emerging. We asked our respondents to also think about confidence-building measures and principles that could underpin regional security. And you will see, again, the variety of responses that came forward. I found very interesting that respondents identified increasing trade among regional states as being an important confidence-building measure. And the Middle East is very well known to be one of the areas of the world that has the lowest level of trade among regional states. And so it was repeatedly identified that by increasing interdependent trade linkages, countries perhaps would have less of an interest in exploiting conflict and would be less competitive with each other, and this would drive greater regional cooperation. Very importantly, of course, an agreement on arms control was identified second here as an important confidence-building measure. And Neil and I have worked on confidence-building measures in other contributions, and we found that arms control, while the most important of confidence-building measures, it is probably the hardest issue to address in cooperative discussions among partners or even non-allies. And so we have recommended that arms control discussions often come towards the tail end of other confidence-building measures, so that there is a pattern of trust or confidence building that you work up to, and so that countries that are working together can see incremental progress rather than have the progress break down right away on the more difficult challenges. But you can see Yemen also, ending the Yemen war, emerged independently by respondents as a huge regional confidence-building measure, was seen to be regionally important, again, because of the multipolarity of that conflict and how it would have broader regional benefits. And of course, climate cooperation, energy, maritime security, religious tourism, cultural exchanges, and COVID were all mentioned. And there are, of course, Track 2 and Track 1.5 initiatives that do seek to try and build on these ideas and build on this dialogue to address some of the different perspectives between regional states on these issues. This is a bit of a breakdown among regional states that were interviewed on the various confidence-building measures that were important for their state. And you will see here, of course, I think not surprisingly for the kingdom here, ending the Yemen war and prioritizing maritime security emerged as two clear confidence-building measures. In the UAE, you see also maritime security emerging as the most important factor or driver that would benefit confidence-building measures. But for Israel, unsurprisingly, arms control. This, of course, it pertains to Iran. But in the Iranian context, you have a very diverse area of responses, perhaps because we did try to interview experts from across the political spectrum, and Iran's politics is much less cohesive, and so you have divergent views, but with trade coming out slightly ahead compared to some of the other countries. As we're nearing the end, we also did ask what principles should countries rely on to underpin a regional security process. And these are principles, I think, that are clear to understand because of the level of conflict in the region, but respondents prioritized or saw détente agreements, de-escalation agreements as being hugely important to reduce conflict, where states would commit to not interfere in each other's affairs at the highest level. Respect for sovereignty and non-interference, of course, is another really critical issue. Ending proxy support for non-state actors beyond countries' borders was also seen to be very, very critical as well. So these issues of confidence-building measures and principles we see would come towards the end of processes that according to our research, would look like this based on the findings of our data and based on the interviewees. Many suggested that a JCPOA reentry process would immediately de-escalate nuclear tensions with Iran, and then from that process, regional states, with the support of external actors, would work on addressing these three tracks. The first track would be a JCPOA plus track. It's oftentimes referred to as longer and stronger, a process that would try to improve upon the JCPOA, address the timelines of the agreement, address some of the criticisms of the deal. And this is an effort, of course, that's underway, not going very well, but underway in the Vienna negotiation process that began in April this year. For the JCPOA reentry process. We haven't gotten to the lengthening and strengthening, and of course there are questions as to whether that is even going to be achievable. The parallel track process, as identified by our interviewees, would be separate tracks to address these four principal conflicts in the region: the Syrian war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has been ongoing for decades, promoting greater dialogue among GCC states, which of course we are seeing underway since the signing of the Al-Ula agreement this January, and of course prioritizing and ending the Yemen war. Through these tracks, the involvement of external actors in Lebanon and Iraq were also addressed. And we have recommendations in the paper on how ending or diminishing the activities of external players, specifically the case of Iran in those conflicts, can be addressed. But I will save that, should you be interested, for Q&A and discussion. And then finally, a third track should include the confidence-building measures that I laid out for you before. And that process, of course, requires time and investment from states, from external actors, but also from multiple levels within each of these states. Confidence-building measure tracks can come from the NGO space, from the academic space, from the think tank space, and beyond. But taken together, they can support greater dialogue among states, greater understanding of threat perceptions, common cooperation on some of these goals that ultimately, over time, can build the foundations of a regional security process. So I think this is the end. I just want to leave you with this final slide, where we did ask our interviewees which actors or countries or organizations have the authority to manage a regional process. And I found these findings to be quite striking, where interviewees saw regional actors themselves as needing to bear responsibility for this process. And I thought this was a huge outcome for our research because, yes, of course, the US is identified next in line, 19% of interviewees, as being important to manage and having the authority to manage these processes, but identifying regional actors as being hugely influential and needing to be involved and not looking to sort of external states to manage these processes, I think has been a huge sort of step forward and a huge shift in the region that I hope that regional states will continue to leverage as we see ongoing bilateral dialogue and multilateral dialogue continue in the weeks and months, if not years ahead. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk you through some of these issues, and I hope that we can discuss them and I can hear your comments and any questions that you might have. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a very rich discussion. And I think we really all need to read the report. I went through it once, but I think after listening to you, I need to go through it again. You alluded to one of the key insights or some of the surprises that you got from the report. Can you, mention something? Was that the main one, or were there other key insights or surprises which came out of the report, other than the fact that regional actors thought that they should take this into their hands?
Sure. Well, that I think was a huge discovery. I have been very happy to see that finding, because I think regional responsibility rather than outsourcing is required to effectively manage regional conflicts. But I think secondly, the priority of building greater trade linkages in the region is a sort of productive and I think positive finding that I saw as important. I think I was also surprised that many of the findings confirmed our assumptions as well. You oftentimes as analysts, you have these assumptions, and I was pleased that there was a consistency in outcome, a consistency in sort of recognizing that regional security was a huge challenge for the region, but how arriving at those challenges required sort of broader time investment, but ultimately a deep awareness that the multiple levels of conflict have become unsustainable for the region. So I think that was also an important finding.
Another point is, when you mentioned some of the models which, were suggested by the respondents, only the GCC was mentioned, and with a minor percentage. So the Arab League was absent, the OIC was absent. Did you get a sense from your respondents why they didn't? Why not have CBMs to improve those institutions instead of creating a new regional institution?
Yes, it's a good question, and I think it's important to consider, frankly, why the Arab League hasn't been effective, because the Arab League has been there since 1945, and I think that there is broad consensus in the interview responses qualitatively that the Arab League hasn't presented a solution to any conflict, that the Arab League oftentimes brings together brings together states that just yell at each other and pass resolutions without any outcome or without any impunity. So it has become a toothless edifice of Arab cooperation rather than a productive entity that has, demonstrated results. And I think the same goes for the OIC, which isn't reflective of only regional states, obviously. So thereby, it hasn't had, hasn't been able to provide the momentum or the unity to drive regional conflict management. And perhaps, what we are sort of presenting is that you don't have to have, let's say, a commonality with your neighbor to solve regional conflict. The commonality is that conflict is no longer in your interest. And because climate change impacts everybody, developing a regional security dialogue to address climate change in a cooperative framework, even though there's plenty of blame to go around, might be a new mechanism for states to try. The collective model that has looked at external players in the case of the region. Obviously, Iran is always a good example. In the past, of course, Egypt was seen as a security threat to some states. Leaving a country out doesn't resolve the conflict. I think, actually inflames the conflict more because there's no dialogue with that country. And so coming together and discussing and talking through the issues might not lead to an immediate resolution, but it will lead to more understanding and perhaps pathways to address some of these differences.
Yeah, I would have thought, I mean, I get your point, but I would have thought, maybe the confidence building measures would have been useful to improve the functionality of, but maybe there's a sense of hopelessness from these institutions. A final question before we bring it to the floor. The report, in the report, there was a sort of stress, I don't know if it was from the respondents or from your own analysis, that international pressure, is important to bring the region towards that new order. But at the same time, most of the respondents were saying that they should be the ones who take action. So my first question is, how does this fit with that? And the other one is, given that in the last decade at least, most of the international intervention has been, well, maybe 2 decades, been disastrous. The US in Iraq and the French and the Europeans and the US in Libya. So international intervention hasn't been good to the region, at least in the last 20 years. So, where does the international pressure be, how would it be useful?
I think that the role of the international community should be to support processes. And oftentimes pressure is needed to support processes, right? To bring actors together, to force states and to engage in dialogue. And I think that's what we were trying to present forward as an idea. Yes, the role of external actors has been devastating, particularly in the Middle East. I'm going to say something controversial. I wouldn't say that Middle Eastern states have done a lot of good in the region either. So, we should call a spade a spade. It's, sort of time for everyone to roll up their sleeves, put their cards on the table, and acknowledge that external intervention has been disastrous, but external activism has also been disastrous. And it has prevented regional states from addressing huge domestic security and huge regional security challenges that are coming from thematic issues rather than just from divergent threat perceptions.
Yeah, but realistically, and this is the last point, follow up on this is, given the last 30, 40 years, let's say, of American or European, not intervention, but pressure on, let's say, for example, the Palestinian issue, and maybe other issues as well. There isn't a record of, a record which can give us confidence that external pressure or at least engagement can actually guide the countries towards some common regional perspective. Do we have a precedence where any international actor actually convinced the region to do something which is for its own good or for the globe?
I'm not sure there is a precedent per se. Well, yes, I think some people might say the JCPOA was a precedent, for example, but there was also a lot of opposition to that process, yeah. Right? But I think what we are arguing here is that because conflicts are so multi-layered, because of the multipolarity that exists in the region, you need the involvement of all of these actors in order to effectively arrive at some end process, but also initial process. You can't see the end of the Syrian war without Russia's involvement. The United States will have something to say, but also regional states will have something to say in that process. So effectively, we're calling for sort of regional engagement in that process, but also support of that by the international community.
Yeah. Well, there's much more, but then we have to bring it out. So, okay, we bring it to the floor. Please, if anyone wants to ask a question, number one, name, affiliation, make it a question, and if it's a comment, very brief. I'll have to excuse myself and interrupt anyone who takes longer. And there are microphones for anyone who needs to ask a question. And yeah, so. If not, I'll be more than happy to continue the discussion. So, okay, Dr. Fahad.
Good evening. Okay, is it okay now?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Dr. Fahad Sharif. I'm a senior research fellow here in the socioeconomic unit. I welcome you. It's a long day, and it's a marvelous presentation, Dr. Neil and you. I think this is a pioneering work. I think it will meet a little bit challenges, but I think it is probably an article to first article, maybe followed by others. The reason is based on the interviews. As I recall from your presentation, the majority, the 24% was the interviewees that indicated that this is a possible way to pursue for the future region. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know exactly who are these interviewees. Are they just politicians? Did you include the economic sector? If yes, then maybe I stop here. If you didn't, then I will jump to the basic argument that really from John Hopkins International Relations and Real School, I will take you back to the 60s, dependency, vulnerability and complex interdependence. You are providing a model of interdependence in trade. Now, for an economics, or
shall we keep it brief?
Okay. Okay, in short.
And Sheikhna بس لازم.
No, believe me, this is a good one. Okay, they might look at it from cost-benefit analysis, rational decision-making. They pursue to do trade between themselves. And in this case, I don't think there is a good chance. I will end up by the beautiful idea of the future challenge of the disaster that may come from climate change and the lessons we should have learned from COVID-19 that should push us to coordination and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to take more than one question and then answer?
As you wish.
Whatever makes you feel comfortable.
I'm happy to answer this, and then.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Fahad. We did take let me just talk for a minute about the interviewees. So in each country, we identified a broad array of policymakers as well as experts that we interviewed from different across the political spectrum, but also with different areas of expertise. We didn't have, I don't have a statistic off the top of my head, but there was an economic angle represented in the sample. But Dr. Fahad, I told you I wasn't going to tell you my personal views. This is just the data speaking. I personally, of course, would tell you this is a very hard process to lay out and convince policymakers to pursue. I agree with you. There is a cost-benefit to the economic angle, but also to the political angle. So, this is a hugely ambitious proposal that we are laying out here with not a degree of confidence. We provided a lot of policymaker briefings when the paper was published, and we shared our findings in almost all of the countries and in many countries in Europe as well. And I think there was a sense of everyone felt a bit overwhelmed by it wasn't going to be easy for anybody. That's why I think we say there's a mix of, deep regional buy-in, lots of pressure, management. I mean, this is an investment, and an investment that would come, I think, probably over a decade, if not more. I'm not sure that this can be arrived at, but we do make the case that the time is now. We have this moment, we have this brief period that could come to an end, depending on regional developments, depending on external developments. The pandemic has been a calming moment, reflective moment, economically devastating, and of course, from a life perspective, devastating. So I think this is a moment for us to reflect if the Middle East wants to continue to be a region that is defined and driven by conflict, because I think the international community is no longer interested in supporting that conflict. And so that, I think, is the existential question for regional states to consider. I leave it there.
Yeah. There's a point he mentioned, Dr. Fahad, something about the Johns Hopkins School, and maybe alluding to a theoretical framework in the background. I mean, was there some kind of theoretical leaning towards one school or another?
There's no. I'm a professor, but also a student of the Johns Hopkins School, and I wasn't taught a certain framework. But of course,
I mean in the report, not in the university.
No, we had no IR framework per se.
Yeah.
I won't speak for Neil, but of course I'm a realist in my approach. Yes, and I think he's nodding. And as analysts of the region, we have become, of course, deeply cynical and skeptical of state-centric approaches as well. So I do think that any approach must actually be interdisciplinary. So you must bring in from all levels, and specifically, I don't think top-down processes work on their own. You definitely need bottom-up process. You need popular buy-in. You need investment from many actors within the state as well.
So we'll keep that point being a realist, because I think a realist reading of the report would be very pessimistic about all of the outcomes, or most of them. It's structurally it's very difficult. But if there's anyone who has a question, في هنا السيدة مين معها المايك؟ تفضلي.
Good evening. Hi, my name is Aya Al-Garni. I'm a research fellow here in the Yemen program at the King Faisal Center. My question has two parts. On the topic of the international pressure, in your report, did you define what international pressure looks like? And the second part is, without international pressure in this picture, how would you say you can create incentives for the cooperation that you would talk about? And can they exist without international pressure? Thank you.
Interesting.
Should I go ahead?
We'll see if there's someone else. تفضل.
مرحبا. السلام عليكم، مساء الخير. أنا مصطفى الأنصاري من اندبندنت عربية. تحية للأستاذة الدكتورة، وتحية أيضا للأستاذ عبد الله.
بس one second, أنت تحتاجين translator or?
I will let you know.
Okay.
Or you can just summarize at the end.
Okay. بس لو ترفع الصوت المايك أعتقد فيه مشكلة. مش منك، الظاهر من
Thank you.
اي كمل بالعربي. شكرا.
Okay, you're okay now? Yeah.
شكرا دكتور وشكرا استاذ عبد الله. من زمان ما سمعنا صوته، وهو كان زميل لنا في الحياة وكان يكتب مقالات رائعة، وهذه الأسئلة التي طرحها على الدكتورة أيضا تحرضها على العودة إلى السياق الفكري وكذلك الصحفي، وهذه دعوة غير مباشرة وإن كانت مناسبة طيبة. السؤال الذي لدي الآن هو حول ما يتردد في الإقليم بأن حين تنسحب أمريكا دائما تأتي بريطانيا للتأثير في الإقليم. أنت كباحثة في المنطقة وأيضا مختصة في هذا الإطار السياسي، ماذا يمكن أن تفيدين في هذا الإطار؟ وهل نتوقع بالفعل أن تعود بريطانيا في هذا السياق وتؤثر على الصراع القائم في الإقليم بدلا من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية؟ إذا كان بالإمكان أطرح سؤال
سريع.
طيب. ذكرتي أن لحل المشكلة في الشرق الأوسط هنالك الكثيرون يعتقدون أن الكثير عليهم أن يتحدثوا فيما بينهم، كذلك هنالك ثقة بالولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ثم جاءت روسيا. هل هذا يعني أن روسيا ستبقى في الإقليم مدة طويلة؟ شكرا.
Okay, شكرا. Thank you. Well, okay, so you have 4 questions. That's a lot.
Pardon?
Yeah, if you go ahead with
Okay.
Yael's and Mr. Mustafa's.
Okay, thank you. Great questions, thank you. On this issue of international pressure, I think that this is where it's important to talk about specifics rather than general, right? So pressure is used in different ways in the region, and international pressure has been repeatedly used perhaps for productive outcomes in certain cases and unproductive outcomes in other cases. The use of sanctions is seen by some to be productive as a tool of pressure in order to convince states to alter their behavior, and in many cases it hasn't also resulted in a shift in regional behavior or in a shift in a country's behavior, and we can point to productive cases. Perhaps Iran, some people say that Iran negotiated the first nuclear agreement in 2013 because of sanctions. I don't think that is the case. But there is a sense that sanctions pressure can alter state behavior through economic pressure. And there is a belief that relying on sanctions relief can then convince a state, like, again, the case of Iran, to alter its behavior regionally or to participate in negotiations. This is also not working. Iran is being promised sanctions relief, and yet the JCPOA negotiations are stuck. They're not coming back to the negotiating table, and the demands are increasing. And perhaps this is a tactic, a negotiating tactic, but I think this is, a reflection of the challenges and the entrenched nature of these conflicts, where pressure by itself doesn't work. And what would probably be more effective is a broader multilateral dialogue, but it's so hard to think about what that is going to look like that is why in our report, I think the interviewees began to suggest let's start with the JCPOA and move to the other issues. What you need to do, I think, at a regional level is, again, go back to understanding state threat perceptions and be able to create a framework that addresses all of the mismatched threat perceptions. And there are limited international tools available to do that. And that's why having, I believe, more regional involvement that isn't solely relying on external states to provide that pressure can create an opportunity. I'm not saying an outcome that necessarily will work. I don't think we have many examples of positive outcomes, but create a new terrain where there is a possibility of greater dialogue over time. This isn't going to be something that comes immediate. immediately. It's going to have to require investment by regional states, by regional leaders. So I think it's a longer process that we have to think about rather than looking for quicker outcomes. But you do need a mix of tools. Some of it is pressure and some of it are incentives, but you have to understand what each state sees as pressure and what state sees as an incentive. And in the case of Iran, as I'm using that example, the international community and regional states don't seem to understand the pressure or the incentives. And so we are still exactly where we were 10 years ago, for example. So thinking about what we are getting or doing wrong or how we are thinking about Iran wrong is important to that process. I haven't heard that the United Kingdom is coming back. Have you, Neil? Just checking. But I think that this is reflective of deeper regional frustrations about the role and commitment of the United States in the region for multiple decades now. There is also, I think, a misperception when I speak to American interlocutors. They don't have a sense that they're leaving the Middle East. They are militarily still present in the Middle East. They are politically heavily invested in the Middle East. But of course, they are calling for what the Trump administration called burden sharing, and I think what the Biden administration refers to as sort of multi-stakeholder engagement, so different ways of saying the same thing, that regional states need to be invested in their own regional security. And that is causing concern about the priorities of the United States. I do think, as someone who follows politics in the United States, that Americans themselves are not as invested in regional wars and regional conflicts as perhaps they were 20, 30 years ago. The impact of the Afghan war, the Iraq war, has shifted the American electorate and has shifted the mindset in the United States. And so it's important to understand how those shifts impact politics at the executive level and in the legislative branch in the United States. And then, of course, it plays out in the messaging. But the relationships, I think, are strong and deep. But at the same time, I do think that it is time for regional states to engage collectively, to manage conflicts independently. And I think that has already been happening. You are seeing, we have been seeing over the past few years, multiple states resolve their differences. You're seeing greater interaction between the UAE and Turkey, dialogue between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We had the Baghdad summit. We're seeing more engagement between Egypt and Turkey. Of course, there's been the very important developments at Al-Ula this year, and I think these are positive signals to build upon. And we're also seeing, of course, greater diversification of relationships with many countries in the region, also building ties with external countries, not solely investing in the relationship with the United States, but also building stronger ties with Russia and China and European states as well. And I think that is a productive outcome to consider going forward. But I can say I don't think that the United Kingdom is coming back. The United Kingdom is investing in its economic agreements with the Gulf states, and I do believe they have an ambition to have a GCC-wide free trade agreement, but that's because they need one domestically. That's because the UK has just gone through Brexit and severed itself and made itself sort of sovereign and no longer part of the European Union, and so it has its own domestic priorities that are driving its relationships abroad. And Russia, I don't think, also is going to abandon its investments in the Middle East. It's not hugely invested. Russia is not a rich country. It is, economically quite challenged and doesn't have the same capacity to provide any kind of security for the region, but it is an opportunistic regional actor, and that it seizes opportunities like its presence in Syria and its involvement in that conflict, and in developing fragmented or diversified relationships with countries all around the region, ranging from Libya to Turkey to Israel to Saudi Arabia to Iran to, I mean, they have relationships with everyone. And that model, I think, is one where you do see regional states also trying to employ. So I think Russia is here to stay, not in a meaningful way and maybe not in a constructive way, but as an opportunistic player, it can provide some openings for other states to develop ties, and Saudi Arabia, for example, has started a military cooperation with Russia, and it's interesting to see how that will develop. At the same time, Russia has a military cooperation with Iran. At the same time, Russia is militarily cooperating with the Syrian government. So there's a lot of fluctuation, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Interesting. Any questions? So I have one question, if there's no one from the audience. Okay, so basically, you mentioned something about, for example, the U.S. In the U.S., your interlocutors don't have the perception that they're withdrawing from the region, but then in the region, there is that perception that the U.S. has withdrawn, and maybe realistically there is a sort of relative disengagement. But this disparity between perceptions, how does it influence the threat perceptions and maybe the perceptions of opportunity? If someone, there is a perception, because of the perception that the U.S. is withdrawing, some people think that there's a power gap which needs to be filled, and that creates competition. So, how does that come into from your discussions?
I think that's a huge driver of conflict or misunderstanding, and hence, thereby, you need more dialogue above all. That's the only way to reduce and narrow the gaps and narrow the misunderstandings. But those misunderstandings take place even among
friends.
Among friends. Look at
the US and the GCC.
The US and the GCC, the US, the UK, and France, and Australia. That was a big divide among old friends that is still playing out in quite a bitter way. And I think it's important to consider very pragmatically, and this is where I'm a realist, that countries have national interests. And while in general those national interests remain consistent, the drivers of threat perceptions do change. And so it's important to recognize how US national interests are shifting, and those are driven by domestic perceptions. It's not personal. It's about the US needing to prioritize some of its own issues. And so perhaps finding mechanisms, more productive mechanisms of cooperation or support, and continuing that dialogue on framework, which I think is very much underway. I think that the US travels more to Saudi Arabia almost than any country in the Middle East. So I think that there's a huge level of investment in supporting the end of the Yemen war, in supporting engagement, in supporting security dialogue and discussions going forward. So I think there are huge opportunities to continue to build upon, but presenting the relationship and presenting the sort of shift in U.S. Threat perceptions, I think, is equally important, perhaps in local context, so that it's understood not as an abandonment or not as the U.S. is really leaving, but rather it is got to prioritize some of its own issues. I mean, January 6th and 7th was a huge shock, I'm sure, to watch here in Riyadh. It was very shocking for many Americans, as are many of the domestic challenges going on in America that many people don't know about. So when you see the economic disparities, when you see many of the challenges, social and economic in the United States, you do realize that there is a domestic demand to try and address these issues.
Excellent. We have just, a very quick question because so we can close and
شكرا لكم. دكتور سعد القرني جامعة الملك عبد العزيز كلية الإعلام والاتصال. شكرا للباحثة، شكرا لكم على هذه الندوة. بودي أسأل الباحثة هل تطرقت إلى البعد الأيديولوجي عندما ناقشت أو قابلت مجموعة من الخبراء والمهتمين في إطار الشرق الأوسط؟ هل البعد الأيديولوجي يؤثر على مثل هذه التحالفات أم أنه مستبعد من هذه التحالفات؟
interesting question.
شكرا.
Thank you. Yes, ideology very much drives threats and affects alliances. And of course, that no doubt emerged in the qualitative responses of our interviewees as many identified divergent ideology, divergent worldviews as driving conflicts and driving, state conflict in the region, as well as conflict with non-state actors as well. But I think that part of this can only really be addressed by, again, thinking about the divergent threat perceptions that exist. Oftentimes, ideology is instrumentalized by the state as a projection of power or to externalize conflict. Creating a bit more understanding among all of the different groups involved in conflicts doesn't mean, again, you're going to resolve the conflict, but creating more awareness can sort of lessen the tension and create opportunities to manage conflict. Really, ultimately, though, all of this is about trying to prevent or trying to think about the human dimension of conflict. I've presented a very state-centric approach to managing regional security, but a big portion of our paper looks at how individuals across the Middle East and North Africa have been deeply impacted from economic, social, human rights, social justice perspectives, and poverty levels are increasing, climate challenges are increasing. There's lack of trust within the Middle East, not just at the state level, but at the interstate level and among communities. And that is ultimately, I think, quite devastating for the future of the region, for prosperity of the region, for future generations. So thinking about it at a human level can perhaps make us consider how urgent it is. The Arab Spring was a decade ago, and today there was, of course, a coup in Sudan. And so thinking about how there's so much frustration in the region, there's so much economic injustice in the region, and thinking about how so many lives have been lost through these cycles of wars and conflicts, I think gives us a sense of the human dimension and perhaps the level of responsibility in trying to draw down and manage conflicts in the Middle East.
Well, excellent. And I think, highlighting the human dimension is an excellent way to conclude this session. It's been a very rich discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanam Vakil, and thank you everyone for coming. And it's a great report. Thank you, Dr. Neil, also for being part of this report. He's also, I wish he was here, but he wasn't. And thank you all. شكرا لكم جميعا للحضور، وبس شاركوني في الشكر والترحيب مرة أخرى بالدكتورة سنام. Thank you. Bye-bye. Excellent.